What is going on, everyone? In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to install, set up, and use Vagrant. Now, if you don't know what Vagrant is, it's a tool used to manage, provision, and automate your virtual machines. It's a very portable environment container that can be used for developing and running applications. And if this sounds any bit familiar to you guys, it's pretty similar to how Docker works. They both kind of address the same problem. They just go about it doing it in a slightly different way. But Vagrant has a lot of benefits. It makes it so that we don't have to manually provision virtual machines from scratch. It actually uses a configuration file to provision and set up all the required virtual machines, thus cutting down on the amount of time it takes us to manually click and install each individual operating system on each individual virtual machine. It's also a great tool for developers because it allows them to easily get their testing environment set up, and more importantly, it also ensures that they're always working in the same exact environment. And the benefit of this is that they can share their Vagrant Box with other developers, and they'll know that they will always be testing in the same exact environment and not have to deal with any issues of different versions or different operating systems and things like that. So it doesn't matter if you're using a Windows, Mac, or Linux host machine, the Vagrant Box will be the same regardless of the base operating system. Now, I'm going to show you guys how to set up and install Vagrant on Linux. And the reason why I'm going to do it on a CentOS machine and not, a Mac or Windows machine is because it's really easy to set it up on a Windows or Mac. And I'll show you guys real quick what you have to do that. But for Linux, there's a few extra steps. You got to install some dependencies and things like that. So I'm just going to cover how to do it on CentOS. But I will show you the links to actually get it installed on a Windows or a Mac. It's really easy. It's just like downloading any other application. Now, Vagrant uses or has something called a provider. And a provider is nothing more than a hypervisor that we're going to use to actually create the VMs. And Vagrant supports all the major hypervisors, and that includes VMware, KVM, Microsoft Hyper-V, and Virtualbox. In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to use it with Virtualbox because it's probably the most commonly used and it's free. So before we actually get to installing Vagrant, we're going to have to install Virtualbox. So to do that, all we have to do is, let me open up Firefox real quick. If you're using a Mac or Windows machine, just Google Virtualbox, and the first link is probably what you're going to need. It's going to take us to the VirtualBox page and just go to Downloads. Then just select your operating system. So if you're on Windows, just select that. If you're on Mac OS, just select that. And then you can just go in and it'll just download the file. And then you just install like any other application. For Linux, it's going to be a little bit different. And I'm going to show you guys how to do that. So the first thing is we actually have to install or we have to add the VirtualBox repository. So I'm going to go to the command line real quick, and I'm going to go cd to /etc/yum.repos.d. And then here we have to do a wget for the following link, and I'll put this link in the description as well. And we're going to need root access. All right, once that's done, go ahead and update your repository. All right, now that's complete. We have to install a few dependency packages for VirtualBox to operate and function on a Linux environment. So I'm going to just paste this in here, and I'll paste this command into the description as well. All right, so once all the dependencies are complete, we can go ahead and install VirtualBox now. All right, so VirtualBox has finished installing. Now we have to install Vagrant. To install Vagrant, just go to Google and just search for Vagrant. And it's going to be the first link. Then we want to download the latest version. And if you're running Windows or Mac, go ahead and just select your respective operating system. But we're using Linux, so we're going to select CentOS 64-bit. And if you're using Ubuntu, go ahead and just select this one. But we select this. And instead of actually downloading it, I'm just going to copy the link address. And then what we're going to do is from the command line, we're just going to do yum-y install, and then we're going to paste that link. All right, and Vagrant is now installed, so we've got our environment set up with VirtualBox and Vagrant, and now we can get started on actually using Vagrant. So the first thing that we need to do is actually get a Vagrant box. Now, a Vagrant box is basically just the operating system we want to use for our virtual machine, but it's already conveniently packaged in one of these Vagrant boxes so that Vagrant can then take control of it and spin up numerous virtual machines and make modifications to certain configurations and things like that. Now, there's many places we can get these Vagrant boxes. We can even make our own, but there is a public repository on the Vagrant website that contains a lot of the popular Vagrant boxes. So to navigate to that, just Google Vagrant boxes. And just select this link right here. And so this is the public repository of all the boxes that are available. And you could see there's one for Ubuntu, there's one for CentOS, there's one for Debian. So there's going to be one for most of the major operating systems, and you can search for whichever one you want. For this video, I'm just going to use the Ubuntu/Trusty64. So that's the name of this specific Vagrant box. So we want to download that box so that we can then start using it. And the way to do that is there's actually a couple of different ways, but I'm going to show you how I like to do it. So now before we do that, I want to actually navigate to my home directory. So I'm in my home directory and I want to create a folder that we're going to use for most of our Vagrant related tasks. So I'm just going to call this folder Vagrant and then cd into that folder. So once we're in this folder, what I want to do now is run the command vagrant init, and then I want to provide the name of the box that I want to use. So the name of the box I want to use is Ubuntu/Trusty64. Then when we hit enter, what it's going to do is it's actually going to generate a configuration file in the directory that we're in. And that's why I wanted to actually make that Vagrant directory so that we know that when we're in this folder, we're handling all the Vagrant related tasks. So it generated this file called Vagrant file. And let's take a look at this file just to see what it did. Now this file is decently long, but don't worry, almost 99% of it is just unnecessary comments. The only lines you need to be concerned with is we have this first line here, which is just the start of the configuration. And then if we go to the bottom of the file, we have the end. So that's just going to be the end of the configuration. And then anything in between is the different configurations we want Vagrant to enforce. So let's go back to the top. And if we look through the file, there's only one actual config that's been put in this file by Vagrant, and that's this line right here. So what this is saying is the Vagrant box that we want to use is called Ubuntu/Trusty64. So that's the one we're going to be using whenever we use this config file. And it knows to look in that public repository to actually download the image. So you don't actually have to download it yourself. It'll automatically do that. Now, as I stated before, there are other places where you can download Vagrant boxes, and you can even make your own as well. So there's some other options we can provide here if that's the case. So the first thing I want to do is, let's say we wanted to download a specific version of this box. we can actually do that by adding this extra line, and it would be config.vm.box_version, and then we would just put the version, and we can call it 1.1.0 or something. So this would download the version 1.1.0, but we don't want that. We just want the latest version of the box, so I'm going to leave that off. Now let's say that we wanted to actually use a Vagrant box that's from a different location than that public repository. We can actually provide a direct link to the specific Vagrant box we want to download. So we can do config.vm.box_URL, and then you just provide the URL. So that'd be like http:// random vagrant site.com or something like that. Wherever the file's stored, you would just provide the link to that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and remove that though. So let's just leave everything as default. So all we have is just we're configuring this specific box. And I'm going to exit out of this. Now the way to actually bring up the box is to run the command vagrant up. Now before we do that, what I want to do is I want to actually open up VirtualBox so we can see it visually as Vagrant provisions our box. All right, so this is VirtualBox right here. Technically, I already created a VM, but let me delete that so you guys don't get confused. So I'm going to run the command vagrant up. And it's going to try and download this box from the website, from that public repository. And then after it's done doing that, it can then go ahead and actually power it up. And this only happens just the first time you do it. Once it imports that original box, it no longer has to do that because it's already going to be saved in our file system. All right, and you may have noticed now that as it powered it up, we can see the new virtual machine that was created by Vagrant. So that's all Vagrant really is doing, is that it's just automating the different tasks that we could do manually using VirtualBox. So it'll configure the it'll provision a virtual machine. It can start and stop it, and it can provide configuration or commands that we want to send to that virtual machine. So instead of manually doing it one by one, if we wanted to provision 50 different virtual machines, that would just be a couple of lines of code in that Vagrant file, and it would automatically handle doing all of that for us. Okay, so now that we have the Vagrant box up, we have to find a way to connect to it. And the way we connect to it is using the command vagrant ssh. All right, so you can tell when you're in the Vagrant virtual machine because their username is going to be Vagrant, and it's going to point to vagrant-ubuntu-trusty-64. So we're in the virtual machine now, and keep in mind that the default username and password is going to be Vagrant for both. So let me just exit out of here. To exit out of the virtual machine, you can either do exit or you can do log out. And I want to point out one thing is that by default, Vagrant uses keys for authentication. So when we SSH'd into it, we didn't have to provide a password. It automatically logged us in. And that's because when we provisioned the virtual machine, you can see right here, it's setting the authentication method to private key. And what it does is it actually copies our key into the authorized keys list of the Vagrant virtual machine. So if we connect back to that virtual machine real quick, we do an ls or ls-la, and we cd into the .ssh folder. You can see there's already an authorized key file. And if we search it, this is our key. So it copied it from our machine and pasted it into this file so that we can automatically get authenticated without a password. All right, so now we're back on our host machine, and I want to show you guys where that actual what key we're using, what private key are we actually using to log in. And the way to find out that is to run the command Vagrant Ssh-Config. So this is our key right here. So if you go to this specific path, this is our private key. And that's what we're using to authenticate with the Vagrant virtual machine. It's going to be this private key right here. Okay, so we have a powered on virtual machine, as we can see right here. There's a few commands using Vagrant that we can either, stop it, we can suspend it, or we can even destroy it. So let's say we want to just suspend the VM. So VirtualBox will remember the current state of that virtual machine. When we suspend it, all we have to do is make sure we're in that Vagrant directory that we created, where the Vagrant file is, and we just do Vagrant Suspend. And when it performs this, just take a look right here. You can see that it's saving the current state of the virtual machine, and it's going to put it in a suspended state. So now it's saved. Let's say we don't. Let's say we want to just stop this virtual machine altogether. We can do Vagrant Halt. So this is going to completely power down the virtual machine. And now we can see that the state changed to powered off. And finally, let's say we want to delete this virtual machine altogether. The way to do that is Vagrant Destroy. So that's going to destroy that virtual machine, and we should see it get removed from this list. There you go, and it got removed. Anyways, let me go ahead and create a new virtual machine with the Vagrant up command. So that's going to re-provision everything. All right, so the machine is powered back up again. And I want to show you guys one thing. If you look here, if you click on your virtual machine, you can see that Vagrant provisions this virtual machine with some default values. So it gave it 512 megabytes of memory, and it's given it 1 CPU, and that's about it. But we can actually change the configuration file so that it provisions it with either a higher amount of memory or more CPUs. And we can really tweak any setting that we want. So if we go into that Vagrant file again, let's just scroll down to the file and let's take a look at the comment section, because it's already got a couple of good, useful examples for us. So this is the section we're concerned with. So I'm going to uncomment this section. Okay, so this is pretty much what you need right here. So this first line is telling us that or it's telling Vagrant that our provider is going to be Virtualbox. And it still worked when it was commented out because by default it uses Virtualbox. But if you wanted to use VMware or Microsoft Hyper-V, then you would change this setting right here to say either VMware or KVM or Hyper-V. So once we configure this line, even though it's not necessary because it's the default, under this setting, we can then change other settings. Like I can change the memory to 1024 because right now it's using 512. I can set it to any value I want. If I want to give it 2 gigs, 6 gigs, 16 gigs, 256 megs of memory, we can. So I'm going to leave it as 1024, so 1 gigabyte. And I'm going to add in an extra line, and I'm going to say I want to give it CPUs, 2 CPUs. So now, if we close out of this configuration file and we do a Vagrant Reload, it's going to reload our virtual machine, and it should reload it with the settings that we configured. So just keep an eye out right here. Let's just verify that the settings of this virtual machine gets changed. Yep, there you go. So you can see here that our base memory changed to 1 gig from 512, and now we have 2 processors. So VirtualBox has this great feature called sync folders. And what it does is it allows us to sync the contents of a directory on our host machine. And in this case, the host machine is this CentOS box, and allows us to sync that. It allows us to sync a folder on this host machine to a folder on the virtual machine. So if I want to transfer files easily, all I have to do is just paste those files into that shared directory, and the virtual machine will automatically have access to it. And the great part is this is already configured by default. And what the default configurations do is, if we check this folder right here, so this is our Vagrant folder that we created. By default, this Vagrant folder is already being shared with the virtual machine. And it gets shared to the location of, I think, /Vagrant on the virtual machine. So if I connect to that virtual machine real quick using Vagrant SSH, and here, if I go to the root directory, there's a folder called Vagrant. So if I cd to Vagrant, and then just make sure you understand the path is just /Vagrant. If we do an ls, you're going to see that there's a Vagrant file here. And the thing is, this Vagrant file is exactly the same as this Vagrant file right here. So this directory, the /home/sanji/vagrant is getting synced with the /vagrant directory on this virtual machine. So if I create a file, and I'll just call this touch, we'll just say virtual machine file. Now if we do an ls, we can see that there's 2 files in this directory, and I'm going to open up a new terminal. Make this a little bigger for you guys. And so this terminal on the right is my host machine. That's the CentOS. And this terminal on the left is the Ubuntu VM that we created. So on my host machine now, if I go to, so we're already in that directory. We're in /home/sanji/vagrant. We can see that this VM-file that we created on the virtual machine gets synced to my host machine. And if I create a file on my host machine, we'll call this host machine-file, and then do an ls over here. Whoops. I forgot to put in touch. Now if we check on the virtual machine, we can see that this file gets created and this directory is shared between the two. And as I stated before, this configuration or this sharing of directories is configured by default. But we can actually configure more directories to be shared. So let me exit out of here. And let's go back into that Vagrant file. And I want to show you guys how to configure a synced folder. So this is an example of how to configure that. And the first thing I want to do actually is I want to show you what configuration is needed to make the default configuration. So what I mean by that is, since we're already sharing a directory and it's the default configuration, what would that actually look like if we had manually configured it ourselves? So the way we would do that is config.vm.synced_folder. And what the folder we want to sync is we would just do a dot. So that implies that this is going to be the current working directory for this Vagrant file, which is going to be /home/Sanjeev/Vagrant. And then we want to do a comma, and we want to point it to the path we want to, or the directory we want to share on the virtual machine. So this would be /Vagrant. So this is the default configuration, but let's go ahead and add in a new synced folder. I'm going to just delete this line. And let's just take a look at where we are in the directory. So we're in home/home/Sanjeev/Vagrant. So let's go up a directory. And let's say we want to share our downloads folder. So what we would do is, let's go here. And then we'll do config.vm.synced_folder, then quotations, and then we want to do a path to that folder. So right now, this command basically is running, you can think of it as it running in the Vagrant directory. So it's like right here, it's in this path. So we want to provide it the path to downloads, so we can do from wherever we are, which is a dot. We actually want to go up a directory to my home directory, then /, then downloads. So we want to share that directory, and we want to share it to, what directory do we want to share it to on the virtual machine? We'll just say /shared folder. And then we can save that. And we'll do a Vagrant Reload so the configs take effect. Right now that our machine is back up, let's SSH to that machine using Vagrant SSH. Now, as I stated before, we were sharing that downloads directory with the I forget what it's called actually, but we can take a look. We're sharing it with the shared folder. So if we go into shared folder, there's nothing in there. So if we make let's say we'll just make a directory and we'll call this virtual machine directory. And if we go back to the host machine, which is what this terminal is, and we go into our downloads directory, you can see the new directory that was made by the virtual machine. And if we make a folder or a file here from the host machine, it should sync it here. So that's how shared directories work. It's a great tool to use. I use it a lot when I want to move some config files over to my virtual machines so that I don't have to go in and configure them myself on the machine itself. And so they can just pull all the configs they need from this shared directory. Now we're still in the virtual machine. Let's say we want to install Apache. We can go in and type in sudo apt-get install Apache. Or, well, we'd actually have to do sudo apt-get update and then sudo apt-get install Apache. And that's perfectly fine, but we can actually configure Vagrant to do that for us when it provisions the virtual machine. And I'll show you guys how to do that. So let's exit out here. And let's take a look at that Vagrant file again. And we want to go to the bottom of the file. There's already an example for us. So right here is where we would configure Vagrant to automatically install or run any commands that we want. So in this example, it's doing already what we want. It's doing app-get update and then an app-get install Apache. So these are going to run these commands on the shell for us when the virtual machine is provisioned. And you'll notice that there's no need for sudo because by default it's going to do it with root privilege. So once I save this configuration, I'm going to do a Vagrant Reload, and it should reload the virtual machine and install Apache for us. So now if I do a Vagrant Reload, it looks like there's an error. What happened here? I forgot to comment this out. All right, so I reloaded the virtual machine, but nowhere in the logs does it point to it saying that it installed Apache for us. And, it could be maybe because it's not actually logging that, but I already know the reason why it didn't happen, and it didn't actually do what we wanted it to do. It didn't install Apache for us. And the reason for that is when you configure provisions like we just did, those only run during the initial Vagrant up. So when the virtual machine gets provisioned for the first time, it'll create those provisions that you specify. But once it's already up, or once it's already created, doing a reload won't do that. So what we can do is we can either destroy the virtual machine and then do a Vagrant up, and then it should work, or we can do a Vagrant reload -- provision, and that'll force it to look at the provisions that we made to the file, and it'll run whatever we asked it to. So it's going to install Apache for us. All right, if you look right here, now we can see that we're getting a few extra output. So right here, it's doing a app-get update. And then down here, it's installing Apache. So it looks like our provisions did work this time. So we just got to wait for it to finish, and we can take a look and verify if Apache did actually get installed. Okay, so it's finished. The virtual machine is up and running, and it installed Apache for us. And hopefully you guys can see just how much easier it is to do it like that. And that way, if we're going to spin up maybe, let's say we wanted to spin up 3 different web servers all in a cluster, we would have to do that manually without Vagrant. We'd have to power on each virtual machine and then do an apt update and then an apt install Apache. And that's going to take a long time. Whereas if we do it with Vagrant, it's going to handle all of that for us. All right, so we know that Apache is running now. How do we verify that it is actually running? Usually if you go to the IP address of the machine running Apache, you'll get that nice little Apache page. The only problem is that how do we actually connect to the machine? There's no IP address or anything like that. I'm not really sure how to connect to it. And the way VirtualBox is set up is by default, I think it gives each virtual machine its own private network, and then it performs NAT. So when the virtual machine wants to reach out to the internet, it'll send traffic to whatever IP address it needs to go to, and then the host machine, which is my CentOS machine, will take it and then perform NAT. So then he'll take the source address of the packet, which should be the virtual machine, and instead he'll change it to his own IP address. So when you're trying to go to Google or something, when that packet reaches Google, it'll think that packet came from my host machine and not the virtual machine. And then when Google responds back, the virtual machine or the host machine will get the packet. He'll perform NAT again and then send it into our virtual machine. So this natting only works when traffic is sourced from the virtual machine itself. It has to initiate the TCP session. If we want to reach the virtual machine from the outside network and initiate the session from a device that's not the actual virtual machine, then it's going to fail. And what we have to do is we have to essentially poke a hole in our host operating system to forward certain ports to the virtual machine. And we've actually already been doing that by default. And if you look at the output, you'll see here forwarding ports. So by default, it's configured to say any packet destined to our host, which is the CentOS machine again, with a port of 2222 will get forwarded to our virtual machine on a port of 22. And this port 22 is the SSH port, so that's how we've actually been SSHing to our virtual machine, is that we just send a packet, an SSH packet, with a port of 2222 to our own IP address, because we're going to send it to ourselves, and then the host will then translate it to our guest of 22. So let's go ahead and do the same thing, but for web traffic, so that we can verify Apache is working. So let's go into our Vagrant file. And there should be a comment already for what we're trying to do. So here we go. This line right here. So this is how we perform the port mapping. So what this is saying right here is any traffic that reaches our host machine with a port of 8080 is going to then get mapped to port 80 on our host, and port 80 is the port that's used for HTTP traffic. And the host IP section right here is just saying our own IP address. So any packet that reaches us with our IP address and a port of 8080 is going to get mapped to a port of 80 on our guest. So I'm going to close that out, and I'm going to do a reload. And if you take a look right here, we can see that we have the new mapping. And that goes along with the SSH mapping because that's part of the default config. But once again, just to reiterate, what's happening is that any packets destined to the host on port 8080 will get sent to the guest on port 80. All right, so I'm going to grab the IP address of my host machine, which is going to be 192.168.0.10. So if we go to our own IP address inside a Firefox web browser, I think I've got one back here. Here we go. We just do http:// paste that. Now, by default, if we just hit enter, it's going to go on port 80. But remember, we want to send it on port 8080 now so that it gets mapped to port 80 to our guest. So if I do port 8080, it looks like it didn't work. Let me check something real quick. There we go. So it's set to localhost because it specified that exact IP address. If I changed it to, let me open that file again. Because I specified the host IP to be our loopback, if I delete this part right here, it should make it so that any packet destined to any of our IP addresses should get properly mapped. And now let's do a Vagrant Reload. All right, now that it's booted back up again, let's get our IP address. And it's still 192.168.0.10. And let's go back to Firefox. And then send it to port 8080. You can see that it properly maps it to our guest machine, and we can see the default Apache homepage. So this confirms that it's working, and hopefully that gives you guys a little better understanding of how the default networking works. Now, with any provider or hypervisor, there's a few different networking options that we can use. So right now we're using that default NAT option where we have to poke holes for certain ports to get mapped back down to our virtual machine, but we do have other options as well. And one of the things we can do is if we go back to that Vagrant file, we can comment this out again. We don't need to do that. And we can configure a private network. So here's an example of a private network. So you just do config.vm.network, call it private network, and we give it an IP of 192.168.33.10. So this is going to configure a private network that's only accessible to the host and to the virtual machine. So no other outside devices can talk to the virtual machine because it's in this private network that only exists between those two devices. So I'm going to save that, and we can do a Vagrant Reload. Okay, now that it's booted up, I wanted to quickly just reiterate what exactly we did. So let me go into that Vagrant file. We configured its own private network, and the the virtual machine should now have an IP address of 192.168.33.10. And with this interface, his specific interface that's going to get that IP address, it does not have access to the outside network. He can't reach the internet. He can't talk to other devices in my network. This is a private network that's only available between the host and the guest. So let's connect to the virtual machine, and let's see if he received an IP address of 192.168.33.10. If we do an IP add, take a look at this interface ETH1. Ignore ETH0, that's the default interface that always gets configured. You can see here he did get an IP address of 192.168.33.10, and this is not a like a publicly routable IP address or network. It's only it's a private network between the host and the guest. But since we are on the host right now, we can actually go to that IP address, and we should see the same Apache page. And we don't need to do port 8080 because there's no port mapping anymore. We're just going directly to that host. And there you go. So we still do have connectivity to our virtual machine, but now it's through the private network, so we don't need to assign any port mappings. Now there's one last networking configuration I want to cover, and that's bridged network. And what this does is it actually configures the virtual machine to be on the same exact network that your host machine is on. So if I exit out here and I do IP add on the host machine, and this is my main interface on my host machine, ENS33. So I'm on the network 192.168.0.10. So I'm on the 192.168.0.0/24 subnet. And when I do bridge networking for the virtual machine, what's going to happen is it's going to look like just another host on this subnet. So he might get like an IP address of 192.168.0.11, and to the rest of the network, he's just going to look like another device on the network. They have no idea that he's just a virtual machine running behind this host. So let's open up the Vagrant file, and I'm going to comment out this line. We don't want that anymore. And now we want to uncomment this line. So this is how we configured a bridged network. So it's called a public network inside Vagrant. And we're going to save that configuration. And now if we do a Vagrant Reload, you're going to see that it actually prompts us for something. And I'll go over it once it shows up. All right, so it's asking us which interface should we bridge that network to, and we have two different interfaces. We have ENS33 and VIRBRO, which I think that's something that VirtualBox uses. But this is our main interface, ENS33. So we want to bridge it to this interface. So I'm going to select option 1. Okay, it finished booting up. We will SSH into that machine. And let's check our IP address. And if you look at Ethernet 1, you can see that we got an IP address within that 192.168.0.0/24 subnet. So once again, this interface, this virtual machine just looks like another device inside my another device on my host machine's network. So any other device can reach me. I'm no different than any other device. So let's take this IP address and let's see if we can reach it from our host machine. Yep, and we can reach it. And even better, I'm actually using Windows 10 right here, as you can see below. And if I grab a Chrome session on my Windows machine and go to the IP address of 192.168.0.16, this should also work. Yep, and there you go. So my Windows machine has no idea that that IP address is actually a virtual machine running behind that Centos VM. So it's just another device on the network. So hopefully that helped clear up how networking works on Vagrant. It's pretty straightforward. You're probably going to just stick with the defaults for the most part, unless you have a specific reason to use one of the other options. Now a cool little thing we can do is if we go to cd/var/www/html, this is actually the file or the HTML file that's getting loaded by Apache. So if we just copy that, and we'll just call this index.html.backup. And then if I go into the original index.html, whoops, you can see the HTML document, and we can just delete everything. And I'm just going to write my own h1 tag. And we'll just say, this is my new homepage. Save that. And if we pull up Chrome again and refresh, you can see that the changes get applied. Now let's exit out of my virtual machine. I want to show you one last thing. You know, as I showed you before, if we provision a virtual machine and we want to also make it run a few commands like installing Apache and things like that, we can use the provisioning section like we did below with the config.vm.provision to run the commands that we list below. Now, if we have a lot of commands, like let's say we want to install a full LAMP stack and we have to install PHP, we have to install MySQL, and there's a lot of commands necessary for that, and it may get a little messy to just paste all of those commands in here. So what we can do is we have another option, and we can actually configure a bash script on our host machine, and we can use that, and we can use Vagrant to call the bash script to then install and run all the necessary commands. So as an example, I'm going to delete these lines because we don't want them anymore. And let's go back up to the top. And I think there should be some comments showing us how to do that. Yeah, I don't know where it is. I'll just type it out myself. So what we can do is we can do config config.vm.provision, and then we do :shell, comma, but now we do path colon and then the name of the script we want to run. So I'm going to call this script bootstrap.sh, and the path I'm giving it, I'm basically not giving it a path, so I'm saying it's going to be in that Vagrant directory we created. So I'm going to save that, and let's create that bootstrap file. So all I'm doing here is I'm updating, I'm installing Apache, and then finally the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, actually let me change that to Vagrant. I'm going to take the index.html that I create, I'll call this my file. Actually no, we got to call it index.html. And it's going to take the file from the Vagrant folder that's being shared with my host machine, and it's going to copy it into the directory that Apache uses to display the home page. So I also have to make that index.html file. Right, so now I've got everything set up, but just to reiterate what's happening, we've configured Vagrant to load up this bootstrap.sh file, and it's going to run that script, and that script is going to install Apache, and it's going to copy that file over so we have that new HTML file that I just created. So let me destroy our current VM. And now that it's destroyed, we can do a Vagrant up, and it should automatically bring up the virtual machine, install Apache, and then copy that file that I've configured over. Alright guys, so it's finished reloading, and let's verify if the bootstrap.sh config was properly loaded so that it installed Apache and updated the index.html file. Alright, so now it has an IP address of 192.168.0.17 because that's just whatever my THCP server gave it. Let's copy that, and let's go to my Windows machine, and let's paste it and see what happens. Alright, look at that. So now we got the new homepage where it says, "Isn't automation great?" And I don't know if that was confusing or not for you guys, but let me just recap exactly what we did. So the first thing that we did was, under the Vagrant file, we put in this line right here, which basically tells it that when we provision a new box, a new virtual machine, we want to load the bootstrap.sh bash script that we've configured, and this bash script has to be located inside my Vagrant directory that I created on my host machine. So if we exit out of here, you can see we're in the Vagrant directory, and you can see the bootstrap.sh file. And if we cat the bootstrap.sh file, what it's doing is it just runs apt-get update, and then it does an install of Apache 2. And we don't need sudo because it automatically assumes root privilege. Then the last line, what it does is it takes the file index.html, which is located inside this Vagrant directory right here. Sorry, what it's actually doing is it's taking the index.html file on the virtual machine. But if you remember, this directory, home/sanjeev/vagrant, gets shared with /vagrant on the virtual machine. So it takes this file, and then it overwrites the index.html file at this path, which is the default index.html file that Apache uses. And that default page gives you this page right here. So if we SSH into our virtual machine again, and we go to /vagrant, and we do an ls, you can see that there's no actual index.html file here. And the reason for that is because we did the move command. So it took the index.html file that was here, that's being shared from our host machine, and it's copying it to /var/www/html, and it's pasting it in here, which overwrites the original index.html file. Alright guys, the last thing I wanted to show you is how to manage multiple virtual machines using a single Vagrant file. To do that, let's go ahead and open up the Vagrant file and I'll show you how to do that. Alright guys, the last thing I wanted to show you is how to manage multiple VMs using the Vagrant file. So let's go ahead and open up the Vagrant file and I'll show you how to do that. So I deleted all the unnecessary comments in the previous configurations I had so we can just start from scratch essentially. And what I want to accomplish now is I want to create 3 different VMs. I want to make 2 different VMs that are going to be configured as web servers, and I want to configure a 3rd VM that'll be running as our database. And the difference between the web servers and the database VM is that the web servers are going to run Ubuntu and obviously have Apache installed, and the database virtual machine is actually going to run CentOS and it's going to have SQLite installed. So first, to do that, let's configure our web servers. Since we're managing multiple virtual machines now, we have to define a section for each virtual machine that we want to build. And the way to do that is we type in config.vm.define, then the name. So let's give this a name of web1. So this is going to be our first web server. And then we'll call this web. And then underneath this line, we're going to have all the configurations for this web server. So we're actually going to have an end statement right here. And then everything between here is the configuration for web 1. So what I want to do is we're going to do now, instead of doing config.vm.box, we're actually going to do web. So we take this name right here, and then we do web.vm.blah to define a certain configuration. So we do web.vm.box, and we can specify which specific box we want to use. So we're going to use the one we've been using before, which is Ubuntu Trusty 64. And now let's give this a host name. And this is actually a requirement. Every individual virtual machine needs to have its own host name. And we can do that with web.vm.hostname. And we'll call this web server 1.test. And now let's define the network it's going to be on. So I'm going to give it its own private network. With an IP of 172.16.20.5. And lastly, let's give it some provisions so that it automatically installs Apache 2. So that's our configuration for our first web server. Let's go ahead and make the second one now. And it's going to follow pretty much the same exact outline. We're going to do config.vm.define, then the name of this web server. So we're just going to call this web2. Could be a type web. And then pretty much everything else can be copied. The only thing we're going to change is the host name and the IP address. Change this to webs. I don't know why I called it web server too, but whatever. Actually, it's not too late to change. That's a web server and web server. And we'll change this IP address to 20.6. Now, where things get different is for the last virtual machine, since we want it to be a CentOS VM as well as have SQLite installed. So to do that, we're going to start off with the same line, config.vm.define. We'll call this database. Now this time the difference is going to be we're going to configure a different box. So we're not going to use Ubuntu for this. We want CentOS. So let's go to the public repository. And let's see if we can find the CentOS box. So the CentOS box is called CentOS/7. And I've already made a mistake. So here we don't use web anymore because now this is called DB. So we want to change this to db.vm. So I'm going to put this guy on the same private network as the other two virtual machines. Just give it a different IP address. All right, so that completes the total configuration. Just to walk you through what we did for this last one, we defined it as a database. So we're going to call this DB, and then anytime we want to make a configuration change for this type of virtual machine, we have to prepend it with DB, and then the configuration that we want. So we're going to use CentOS. We're going to give it a host name of database.test. We're going to put it on the same private network as the other two VMs, but give it an IP address of 172.16.20.55. And then we're going to provision it with so we're going to provision it so that it updates yum and then installs SQLite. And now we can do a Vagrant up, and if our configuration's okay, should get started on configuring all those virtual machines. Yep, it looks like we made an error. So let's see, line 42 and 35. This shouldn't be an end right here. This should be shell. All right, now that it's booting, we can see that it's starting up Web 1. After it finishes that, it's going to get started on Web Server 2, and then it'll finish off by configuring the database server. All right, so it finished installing and setting up Web Server 1, and now it's getting started on Web Server 2. All right, so Vagrant has finished starting up all 3 virtual machines. And if we take a look at Virtualbox real quick, we should see all 3 virtual machines running. Yep, so you can see here we've got Web Server 1, Web Server 2, and then the database. So now we have 3 virtual machines. To connect to a specific virtual machine, we have to do Vagrant SSH and then the name that we gave it. So we've got Web 1, and that's going to connect us to Web Server 1. Now let's verify that we successfully installed Apache on our web server. So for that, we can just do apt list -- installed pipe Apache. Yep, and it looks like it did install it. And if we check our IP address, it's going to be the 172.16.20.5 that we gave it. Let's check Web Server 2 now. All right, Web Server 2 installed Apache as well. And it got its IP address of 172.16.20.6. And now let's finally check our database. And if you remember, our database is running CentOS. So let's verify that it's running CentOS 7. Yep, there we go. It's running CentOS 7. And lastly, let's verify that it installed SQLite. There you have it, guys. It successfully installed SQLite. So with that single Vagrant file, we were able to provision 3 different VMs, all with 3 different configurations. So hopefully you can see the benefits of using Vagrant and automating your test setup. And that's pretty much all I had for you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more Vagrant videos, just let me know in the comments.